The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their steady buzz mixing with the low crackle of electric clippers. Each vibration seemed to echo off the cinder block walls, bouncing through the air like a cruel joke that refused to end. The smell of bleach and cold metal hung heavy in the small New Orleans County holding room. On the cement floor, black curls gathered like fallen petals, thick, soft, and endless. The two officers laughed. Their uniforms were wrinkled, their mouths curled into mocking grins. They looked down at the woman sitting before them, her wrists bound, her back straight despite the restraints. Her name was Naomi Carter, though neither man had bothered to check the arrest report. To them, she was just another black woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, another protester who needed to be taught a lesson. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply lifted her chin, her eyes steady and sharp, cutting through their laughter like a blade through glass. "Tomorrow at 9 a.m., she said, her voice calm, clear, resonant. "You'll understand what justice really means." The words barely registered at first. Officer Blake Rivera let out a short, derisive snort, pretending to be amused. His partner, Sean Dalton, angled his body camera for a better shot, smirking as if documenting a trophy kill. "Got to record this in case the higher-ups want proof," Rivera said, holding the woman by the shoulder. His hand was heavy, his touch a declaration of power. Dalton chuckled. "She ought to be grateful. Free haircut, right?" The clippers buzzed again. A long stroke ran straight down the center of her head, exposing a pale strip of scalp under the harsh white light. Dalton's grin widened. Rivera leaned closer, his breath hot and sour with coffee and arrogance. "Sweetheart," he said softly, almost playfully, "protocol is whatever we say it is." Naomi didn't move. Her face was a portrait of restraint, the faintest tightening of her jaw the only sign of what burned beneath the surface. 30 years she had spent behind a bench, presiding over rooms just like this, rooms where men like these swore oaths to uphold the very laws they now desecrated. She had signed warrants, sentenced abusers, upheld statutes meant to protect dignity. Now she sat shackled under the same fluorescent glare, her dignity hanging by the thread of her composure. A younger inmate across the room, barely 20, eyes wide with disbelief, lifted his phone discreetly through the bars. "This ain't right," he whispered. "Somebody's got to see this." Dalton caught the motion and barked, "Put that down or you'll lose your fingers." The boy froze. Naomi turned her head slightly, her expression calm, her meaning unmistakable. She shook her head once. "No, not yet." When the final lock of her hair dropped to the floor, Rivera stepped back, inspecting his handiwork with the self-satisfaction of a craftsman. "Look at that," he said. "Clean as a whistle." Dalton laughed again, the sound hollow. "Guess she won't be preaching in court anytime soon." Naomi's eyes rose to meet the lens of Dalton's body camera. "You're recording your own downfall," she said. For a second, something shifted in the air. Dalton's grin faltered. He blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" Naomi said nothing. She didn't have to. The silence itself carried weight, an unspoken prophecy settling over the room like a gathering storm. Rivera shoved her toward the metal bench, irritation replacing humor. "You think you're better than us?" "No," Naomi said quietly. "I just know the law better than you ever will." Across the holding cell, the other inmates exchanged glances. Some smirked, thinking she was mad. Others whispered prayers. None of them knew who she was, not yet, but everyone could feel the gravity in her voice. That unmistakable authority born not of position but of conviction. When the intake officer entered with a clipboard, the laughter subsided. The officer was young, nervous, carrying the paper armor of bureaucracy. "Charges," he muttered, reading aloud, "disturbing the peace, resisting arrest. Assault on an officer." The word sounded absurd even to him, bouncing against the concrete walls with no conviction. Naomi's face was unreadable, carved from quiet resolve. The intake officer hesitated. There was something about her posture, her diction, the controlled cadence of her breathing, that didn't belong in this room. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, do you have any ID on you?" Rivera cut him off. Doesn't matter. She's ours until morning. Naomi turned to the officer, her voice cool but firm. Every word spoken in this room is being recorded. Every act performed here will have consequences. I suggest you remember that. The young man swallowed. Something in her tone, the authority that made men stand when she entered a courtroom, found its way through the noise. Outside, thunder rolled across New Orleans, low and distant. Rain began to patter against the narrow window, soft at first, then steady. Inside, the clippers fell silent, replaced by a tense stillness that even Rivera and Dalton couldn't laugh through. Dalton scuffed the floor with his boot, grinding a clump of Naomi's hair into the concrete. "Guess this is what justice looks like," he said. Naomi looked straight ahead. "No," she whispered. "This is what injustice sounds like. Justice is quieter. It arrives when no one's laughing anymore." For a heartbeat, even the humming lights seemed to falter. The men shifted uneasily, something about her composure gnawing at the edges of their bravado. Rivera tried to recover the mood. "You talk a big game, lady," he muttered, forcing a smirk. "Bet you'll change your tune after a night in holding." But her gaze didn't move. She was memorizing them, every badge number, every sneer, every moment of their cruelty. And though none of them could know it somewhere behind those calm eyes, she was already turning this humiliation into evidence. The intake officer busied himself with paperwork, trying to shake the chill in the room. "Booking number?" he asked, his pen trembling slightly. "Not important," Rivera said. "Just another mouth to feed till morning." Naomi's hands were still cuffed. The metal dug into her wrists, but she didn't flinch. "You don't even know who I am," she said softly. Dalton laughed. "Lady, we don't care who you are." "That's your first mistake," she replied. He scoffed, but the words lingered longer than he expected. Outside, thunder cracked louder now. Rain drummed harder against the window. The storm was closing in. Naomi exhaled slowly, her breath steady. The humiliation had been deliberate, meant to strip her of identity, but it hadn't worked. Beneath the shaved scalp, the quiet voice, the smallness of that cell, her authority remained untouched. The young inmate across the way, the one with the phone, watched her in awe. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked softly. Naomi turned her head, the faintest trace of a smile ghosting across her lips. "I'm fine," she said. "Justice just takes time." Dalton heard and sneered. "Justice," he repeated mockingly. "You people love that word. Always talking about justice." Naomi's eyes lifted to meet his again. "And you fear it," she said. He turned away. The rain became a roar, a rhythm against the glass like the ticking of a clock. Somewhere beyond that narrow window, the city kept moving, cars splashing through puddles, neon lights flickering across Bourbon Street. 1,000 lives unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding in a forgotten corner of the jail. Rivera crossed his arms. The false confidence of a man who believed the badge on his chest could shield him from consequence. He had no idea the storm outside wasn't the one he should fear. Naomi sat perfectly still. Her eyes closed briefly, just long enough to steady herself. Her mind was already retracing every step of the day, her morning run, the sound of sirens, the flash of confusion when they'd grabbed her, the way the cuffs had clicked shut without question. She had heard countless defendants say those same words in her courtroom. "I didn't do anything." And for years she'd believed she understood them. Now she finally did. The hum of the lights returned, relentless and sterile. Rivera yawned. Dalton scrolled through his phone, pretending boredom. The moment of tension had passed for them. But for Naomi, it had crystallized into something sharp, unbreakable. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of theirs. When the intake officer returned with a clipboard for signatures, he avoided her eyes. Rivera scrawled his name, slamming the pen down. "Done here?" he asked. The officer hesitated. "You sure you want to process her under the protest charges?" "Absolutely," Rivera said. "She'll learn her lesson." Naomi looked at the officer. "You'll learn yours too," she said softly. He flinched. For a long moment no one spoke. The rain beat harder. The hum of the lights deepened. Naomi sat tall on the metal bench, hands cuffed in front of her, her newly shorn head gleaming faintly under the fluorescent glare. In her silence, there was no submission, only the calm before revelation. Rivera gathered the evidence bag, tossing her few belongings inside: a phone, a set of keys, and a sleek silver pen she always carried. He didn't notice the tiny light blinking on its side, or the soft click that marked the beginning of a recording. Dalton turned to leave. "See you in the morning, sweetheart," he said, "if you're lucky." Naomi's eyes followed him until the door shut behind them. Then she let out a slow breath. The room was quiet except for the rain and the faint dripping of a leaky pipe. The air smelled of bleach and steel and something deeper, something like reckoning. In that cold, colorless cell, Naomi Carter realized how fragile dignity could seem when placed in the wrong hands, and how powerful it could become when protected by the right voice. The humiliation was complete. But so was her resolve. Outside, lightning split the sky over New Orleans, illuminating the narrow jailhouse window for just a second. The storm had arrived inside. Naomi sat alone on the bench, head bowed, eyes open, the faint hum of the clippers still echoing in her memory. She didn't know yet that within hours her name would ignite the conscience of a nation. But she did know this: justice, though silent now, was listening. 24 hours before the clippers buzzed and the laughter echoed through that concrete room, Judge Naomi Carter stood in her chambers overlooking the Mississippi River. Morning sunlight spilled across New Orleans, tinting the skyline with gold and fire. The river glimmered in slow waves beyond the courthouse windows, wide and eternal, carrying secrets and sins alike down toward the Gulf. Inside, the air was still, filled with the faint scent of coffee and polished wood. Her office was a sanctuary of order. Diplomas and commendations lined the walls: Harvard Law, Yale Fellowship, federal judicial appointment, symbols of every barrier she had broken, every battle she had won. Yet that morning, even the framed achievements seemed heavier than usual. The robe laid neatly across her desk felt like a burden she wasn't sure she wanted to lift. 2 folders sat on the mahogany surface before her. Both thick, both waiting for her signature. Each bore a single name: People vs. Rivera and People vs. Dalton. She had presided over their trial for weeks. The evidence was clear, damning in its precision. Reports falsified, cameras tampered with. A 17-year-old boy in Baton Rouge beaten into a coma because 2 men in uniform thought their power made them gods. The jury had returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. Tomorrow morning, Naomi Carter would sentence officers Blake Rivera and Sean Dalton. She should have felt satisfaction, closure, but instead, a strange heaviness had settled in her chest, like the quiet before a storm. A knock came at the door, soft, hesitant. Her law clerk, Ethan Brooks, stepped in. He was young, earnest, and far too nervous for a Monday morning. His tie was crooked, his folder clutched like a shield. "Judge Carter," he said, "the police union just filed another motion for recusal." Naomi didn't look up immediately. She took a sip of her coffee, eyes still on the river. "Recusal?" she asked. "On what grounds this time?" "They're claiming you're biased against law enforcement." Naomi smiled faintly, tiredly. "Biased?" she repeated. "Because I think police officers should obey the same laws as everyone else." Her tone was calm, but it carried that subtle fire Ethan had learned to recognize, the quiet, unwavering kind that made even seasoned attorneys lose their footing in court. He shifted uncomfortably. "They're also requesting the sentencing be postponed until next week." "Denied," she said instantly, setting her mug down with a soft clink. "They've delayed accountability long enough." Ethan nodded, scribbling her decision onto the motion form. She signed it, her pen gliding smoothly, the signature elegant and deliberate. Her phone buzzed beside the stack of files. A text flashed across the screen. "Ava. Mom, the protests downtown are getting tense again. Promise me you'll be careful today." Naomi's expression softened. Her daughter's messages were always a mixture of worry and faith. Ava Carter, 23, studying political science in Atlanta, had inherited her mother's fire, but not her mother's calm. Naomi typed a brief reply. Naomi, don't worry, baby. Justice has a way of working itself out. She put the phone down, but the words lingered. Justice. The word that had shaped her entire life now felt fragile, like a candle flickering in a draft. She had spent decades defending it, defining it, delivering it from the bench, but lately it seemed to have grown smaller, buried under bureaucracy, excuses, and fear. She rose from her chair and crossed to the window. Outside, the city pulsed. From this height, she could see the early stirrings of the protests gathering near the courthouse steps, signs rising like small fires in the distance. No justice, no peace. Stop badge immunity. Accountability now. Her reflection stared back from the glass. 54 years old. The lines on her face carved by years of cases that never ended cleanly. Every victory seemed to demand a piece of her soul. She touched the glass lightly as though tracing the horizon. Impunity, she murmured to herself. It's become part of the uniform. She turned back to her desk, glancing at a small silver pen lying near her files, a gift from Ava. It wasn't an ordinary pen. A discreet recording device hid within its body, something Ava had bought after a series of anonymous threats arrived at the courthouse. Just in case someone crosses a line, Ava had said. Naomi had laughed it off, promising she'd never need it. But she kept it with her anyway, tucked into her purse beside her keys and pepper spray. For peace of mind. For just in case. By noon, the courthouse clock chimed through the building. Naomi gathered the Rivera and Dalton files, aligned them neatly, and exhaled. She had read every report, reviewed every motion, and still the ache in her chest remained. She needed air. Running had always been her ritual before big decisions. The rhythm of her steps helped her think, helped her let go. She changed into gray sweatpants, an old LSU hoodie, and her worn running shoes. The black judicial robe stayed behind on the chair, folded with precision, watching her as she left the room like a silent witness. Outside, New Orleans was alive with tension. The air carried humidity thick as breath. Protesters gathered downtown, their chants rolling up through the streets like a drumbeat. Helicopters circled overhead, news crews positioning cameras near the courthouse gates. Naomi tied her shoelaces tighter, slipping the recording pen into her hoodie pocket out of habit. The chants grew louder. No justice, no peace. Stop police corruption. Justice for Tyrone Blake. She had presided over that case too. The boy whose bruised face now appeared on handmade posters taped to streetlights and fences. Justice for Tyrone. She had promised his mother that justice was coming. Naomi jogged past a group of volunteers handing out water bottles to the crowd. A young woman recognized her but said nothing, just gave a respectful nod. Naomi nodded back. In that brief exchange was something sacred, an understanding. For a moment, wrapped in her hoodie, she wasn't a judge. She was just a woman trying to breathe in a city that seemed to be suffocating. A few blocks away, in the police precinct locker room, Blake Rivera adjusted his bulletproof vest and grinned at his reflection in the mirror. His partner Sean Dalton sat nearby, loading his belt, tapping his baton against the bench in rhythm. You see who's sentencing us tomorrow? Rivera said, voice dripping with disdain. Dalton grunted. Who? Judge Carter. The Crusader Queen herself. Dalton spat into the sink. Figures. Another liberal trying to make headlines by hanging cops out to dry. Rivera chuckled. Maybe we'll get lucky. Dalton raised an eyebrow. Lucky how? Rivera smirked. Maybe she'll find herself on the other side of the bars one day. They both laughed, the sound low and mean. Neither realized how prophetic those words would become. Back on the street, Naomi slowed her pace near Jackson Square, where the protest had swelled into a living tide. Signs waved above heads, chants thundered, and the smell of sweat and asphalt filled the air. The energy was electric, righteous and raw. Police lines formed at the edges, shields gleaming beneath the Louisiana sun. The heat made tempers short, patience shorter. Naomi considered turning back. She was a judge, not a participant. But then a gust of wind lifted a flyer from the ground, pressing it against her leg. Justice for Tyrone Blake. The boy's photo stared up at her, eyes bruised but unbroken. She crouched, smoothing the crumpled paper. Something in her chest tightened. It felt as if the city itself was speaking to her, whispering the same truth she'd carried for years. You can never look away. A sharp crackle sounded from a police loudspeaker. All units move forward. Crowd control authorization confirmed. The words sliced through the air like a blade. Naomi's breath caught. She knew that tone. It was the sound of escalation. Then the crowd shifted. A ripple of panic spread like shockwaves through water. The first canisters hissed, releasing white clouds of tear gas that curled and clawed through the streets. People screamed. The chant collapsed into chaos. Naomi stumbled back, coughing as the sting burned her eyes. She pulled her hoodie over her face, trying to shield herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, Ava's name lighting up the screen. But she dropped it, the device clattering onto the pavement. Through the haze, silhouettes of armored officers emerged. Their voices cut through the noise. Disperse immediately or face arrest. Naomi raised her hands instinctively. I'm trying to get to my car, she called out, her voice muffled by the fabric. One of the officers pointed. You in the gray hoodie, stop right there, she froze. The voice was familiar. Rivera. Before she could respond, Dalton stepped forward, baton in hand. You were throwing rocks at officers, he barked. I wasn't throwing anything, she said, forcing calm into her voice. I'm a jogger. I just need to— Save it, Rivera snapped, grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back. Pain flared, sharp and sudden. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed louder than the shouting around them. Resisting arrest, Dalton muttered, almost to himself. I've done nothing but comply, Naomi said, her tone even, though her pulse thundered. Sure you did, Rivera sneered. They all say that. It wasn't fear that filled her, it was disbelief. Disbelief that after all these years, after every ruling, every speech, every victory for fairness, she now stood exactly where the people she had defended once stood. The irony might have been poetic, if it weren't so bitter. Officer, she tried again, breath tight. Please check my ID, my name is Naomi. Dalton cut her off. You've talked enough. You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself downtown. Rivera smirked. Yeah, maybe the judge will go easy on you. Naomi almost laughed. Maybe, she said softly. They didn't hear the weight in her voice. The van door slammed behind her. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with the smell of rubber and metal. Her wrists burned where the cuffs bit into her skin. The city outside blurred into streaks of blue and red through the grated window. Sirens wailed. From the front seats she could hear their voices, casual, careless. Middle-aged woman out here playing protester, Rivera said. You'd think people would learn by now, Dalton chuckled. Stay home. Stay quiet. Stay out of trouble. Naomi closed her eyes. The sound of the clippers had not yet entered her life. But the same cruel rhythm was already there in their voices, in the way they spoke of her as an inconvenience rather than a person. When they reached the precinct, Rivera yanked her from the van. Move, he barked. Naomi straightened, refusing to stumble. I'd like to make a phone call, she said. You'll get your turn, Dalton replied. As they walked her down the corridor, another officer, older, weary-looking, paused at his desk. He studied her face, her posture, the way she carried herself even in handcuffs. Something didn't fit. You sure you've got the right person? He asked quietly. Rivera grinned. Oh, she's the right one. Big Mouth thinks she's above the law. The intake officer frowned. Ma'am, do you have identification? Dalton spoke before Naomi could answer. Already checked. Nothing on her but a phone and some fancy pen. Probably stolen. Naomi glanced down as that pen, the recording device Ava had given her, slipped from her pocket onto the floor. Neither officer noticed the faint blink of its red light as it began to record. She looked at the intake officer and said clearly, You're making a mistake. I want you to remember that I said those words. He hesitated. Noted, he said softly. Dalton laughed, clapping Rivera on the shoulder. You hear that? She wants us to remember. Oh, we'll remember. Naomi met his gaze evenly. Justice isn't something you can mock, she said. It's coming, whether you laugh or not. Rivera's grin faltered. Just for a second. They led her down the hall toward the holding cells, the sound of keys jingling like shackles in the sterile air. Inside each cell, faces watched, some curious, some hollow, some quietly reverent. Naomi held her head high. In all her years behind the bench, she had believed justice was a principle, something argued and reasoned into being. But as the steel door closed behind her, she understood a truth she had never felt before. Justice was not an idea. It was a battle, a pulse, a promise forged in the moment someone refused to bow. And in that instant, bound, bruised, and underestimated, Naomi Carter decided she would not kneel. The storm outside the New Orleans precinct had grown meaner by the minute. Rain lashed against the narrow windows, turning the world beyond them into streaks of gray light and blurred sirens. Inside, the hum of fluorescent bulbs fought the thunder, their cold white glow swallowing color from the room. Judge Naomi Carter sat on a metal bench in the intake room, wrists cuffed, her hoodie damp from the rain, her scalp still untouched by the clippers that waited across the table. The air smelled of disinfectant and old fear. Officer Blake Rivera leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, smirk carved deep into his face. His partner, Sean Dalton, adjusted the camera pinned to his chest, the tiny red light blinking to life. To them, she was not a person, just another suspect. Another name to process before their shift ended. Outside the cell, a young officer scribbled notes on a clipboard, glancing up now and then, uncertain. He didn't know her name, but something about her unnerved him. The way she sat straight-backed, her silence sharper than anger. The arrest report sat unfinished on his desk. Female, black, mid-50s. Resisting arrest at unlawful assembly. He hesitated before writing the rest. No ID. He couldn't bring himself to add combative or non-compliant, the usual placeholders for people like her. It didn't fit. From down the hall, Rivera's voice drifted in. Processing on number 12, he said. Disturbing the peace. Possible assault. The clerk frowned. Assault on who? On me, Rivera replied. He laughed at his own joke. Dalton joined in, chuckling as he plugged in the clippers. Can't wait to see the look on her face when she sees herself in the mirror. Naomi didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the narrow window above the sink where rainwater streaked the glass. The thunder outside rolled low like an echo from something ancient. In her mind, she replayed the last few hours, the confusion, the shouts, the suffocating sting of tear gas, the handcuffs biting into her wrists. She thought of her daughter, Ava, who must be frantic now, calling and texting, wondering why her mother hadn't answered. The image of Ava's last message still burned behind her eyes. Promise me you'll be careful, she had promised. And still, here she was. Dalton switched on the clippers. The buzzing filled the room, a cruel and deliberate sound. Protocol, he said mockingly, stepping closer. Nothing personal, ma'am. Everyone gets checked for lice. Naomi turned her head toward him, her eyes calm, her voice measured. That's not protocol, she said. And you know it. Rivera leaned close, the sour scent of coffee and sweat invading the air between them. Sweetheart, protocol is whatever we say it is. The first lock of her hair fell. The clippers ran again, slow and steady. Black curls tumbled to the floor, one after another, landing in dark, glistening clumps. Each strand carried decades of dignity, of long mornings before court, of small moments where she'd stood before mirrors and reminded herself she belonged in that robe. Rivera watched her face for a reaction. None came. Her eyes didn't blink, her jaw didn't tremble. She simply breathed. Slow, deliberate, unbroken. Gotta document this, Dalton muttered, adjusting the camera for a clearer shot, in case the higher-ups want to see. Make sure to get her good side, Rivera said. Dalton laughed. She doesn't have one. Naomi looked up, meeting the lens directly. You're recording your own downfall. The laughter died for a second. Dalton froze, blinking as if unsure what he'd just heard. What's that supposed to mean? He asked. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was enough, a promise wrapped in composure. Rivera tried to shake off the unease creeping into the room. "You think you're better than us?" he asked. "No," she replied softly. "I just know the law better than you ever will." The intake officer looked up then. Something clicked in his mind, a faint recognition, though he couldn't place it. The voice, the poise, the authority. He had heard that tone before somewhere, maybe on TV, maybe in a courtroom recording. But Rivera cut across his thoughts, barking orders. "She's ours till morning. File it under disorderly conduct." "Yes, sir," the clerk murmured, but his hand trembled as he wrote. When the final strand of Naomi's hair hit the floor, Rivera stepped back, admiring his work. "There," he said. "Looks clean. Almost professional." Dalton grinned. "Guess she won't be preaching in court anytime soon." Naomi turned toward the window again, watching as lightning forked across the sky. "You believe humiliation is justice," she said quietly. "But justice isn't loud. It's patient. It waits." For a moment even Rivera couldn't meet her gaze. Then the door opened and the spell broke. The two officers left, still laughing, their voices fading down the corridor. Naomi sat motionless. Rain drummed harder against the glass and the fluorescent hum filled the silence they left behind. The young intake officer approached hesitantly, sliding her belongings into an evidence bag. A phone, some keys, and a silver pen. The pen blinked once, recording unnoticed by all but her. He hesitated before walking away.
"Ma'am," he said softly, do you want to make a statement?"
Naomi looked up at him, her eyes kind but unyielding. "I already have," she said. "You just haven't heard it yet." The officer nodded uncertainly, leaving the room. Naomi closed her eyes. Beneath the exhaustion, something stronger stirred. A steel thread of conviction pulling tight. Every moment of her humiliation had become evidence. Every insult, every laugh, every arrogant touch, it was all now part of the record. Outside, the storm broke wide open, and by morning, so would everything else. The video hit the internet before dawn. It began as a shaky 30-second clip, filmed by a young inmate who'd hidden his phone beneath the bars of his cell. The footage was grainy, the audio crackling under the hum of fluorescent lights. Two officers stood over a restrained black woman. One laughed, holding a buzzing pair of clippers. The other filmed, grinning. "Smile for the body cam," Rivera's voice said, clear as a bell. The woman didn't flinch. She just stared back, eyes burning with calm defiance. Then came the line that would ignite the nation. "Tomorrow at 9 a.m., you'll understand what justice really means." The clip ended there, but the silence that followed was louder than any scream. By 6 o'clock, justice for Naomi was trending across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. News anchors replayed the footage in slow motion, their voices subdued as if narrating a national shame. At first, nobody knew who the woman was. Some guessed she was a teacher. Others thought a community organizer. But by sunrise, the truth broke like a thunderclap. Breaking update. The woman in the viral video has been identified as federal judge Naomi Carter of New Orleans. The revelation was seismic. Within hours, courthouse reporters confirmed that Judge Carter had been scheduled to sentence two police officers, Blake Rivera and Sean Dalton, the very next morning on charges of excessive force. The same two officers now seen laughing in the video. By 9, the courthouse steps overflowed. Protesters, reporters, clergy, students all gathered beneath hastily scrawled signs. "Dignity has no color. Justice can't be shaved away." She was the law. Helicopters hovered over the crowds. Federal marshals swarmed the jail. Every camera lens in America pointed toward New Orleans. Inside the precinct, Rivera and Dalton were nowhere to be seen. They'd been pulled from duty, escorted out quietly as the department scrambled for damage control. Official statements began flooding the press. An unfortunate procedural misunderstanding, an isolated incident, pending investigation. But no amount of polished language could bury the images the world had already seen. Because in those 30 seconds of footage, there had been no misunderstanding. Only arrogance, only power stripped of conscience. Meanwhile, Naomi Carter had been released quietly through a side door, escorted by U.S. Marshals. Cameras caught only a brief glimpse of her as she stepped into a waiting car, her head wrapped in a simple black scarf, her posture straight despite the weight of the world watching. A young reporter managed to catch her before the door closed. "Judge Carter," he asked breathlessly, "how do you feel about what happened?" Naomi paused, turning toward him. Her eyes were tired, but her voice was steady. "Grateful," she said. "Grateful the truth found its witness." The car door shut, and she was gone. At home, her daughter Ava sat surrounded by chaos, ringing phones, flashing notifications, news vans clogging their quiet street. When Naomi walked through the door, Ava was already crying. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her mother. "Mom," she whispered, voice breaking, "they destroyed your hair." Naomi smiled gently, touching her daughter's face. "Hair grows back," she said. "Dignity doesn't need to." They sat together at the kitchen table as morning light filtered through the blinds. On Ava's laptop screen, headlines scrolled endlessly. Public outrage over viral arrest video. Federal judge targeted in police abuse scandal. Nation demands reform. The phone rang again, CNN. The Washington Post, BBC. But Naomi ignored them all. She focused on what mattered most, the truth. "Ava," she said softly, "did you get the files from my office?" Ava nodded. "Yes, the Rivera and Dalton cases. But Mom, I need to see them." Her daughter hesitated. "Mom, you can't go back to court tomorrow." Naomi's gaze hardened. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." For a moment, Ava just stared, torn between fear and awe. There was something unshakable in her mother's eyes, a quiet power that even humiliation couldn't erase. Outside, the storm clouds began to thin. But across the nation, another kind of storm was building. Civil rights attorneys called for federal review. The ACLU issued a statement demanding justice. Churches organized vigils. Politicians scrambled for the right words while citizens found their own. Enough is enough. And through it all, the video kept playing. Over and over, that final look in Naomi's eyes before the camera blinked off. Not fear, not anger, certainty. By noon, federal investigators located the missing pen, recovered by a janitor sweeping the intake room. When they played the recording, it captured everything. Rivera's laughter, Dalton's mockery, Naomi's calm warnings, and finally, the silence after realization crept in. The evidence was irrefutable. By evening, both officers had been suspended without pay. The department's press release called it a temporary measure pending review. But online, people tore the words apart. One post summed up the mood perfectly. "You don't laugh during a misunderstanding." The clip had become more than evidence. It was a mirror. A reflection of every injustice brushed aside, every humiliation unseen. That night, Naomi sat in her living room, surrounded by unopened mail and boxes of old case files. Her robe lay folded neatly on the chair beside her, black fabric glinting faintly in the lamplight. The phone buzzed constantly, reporters, colleagues, judges, but she ignored it all. Then one text appeared from a number she hadn't seen in years. "You once told me justice always finds a way. You were right." It was from a former clerk who'd quit years ago after witnessing police misconduct go unpunished. Naomi read it twice, then smiled faintly. Ava entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You know they're saying this could change everything, right?" she said quietly. Naomi looked up. The soft light caught the smooth curve of her newly shorn scalp beneath the scarf. "Not everything," she said, "but maybe enough." On the TV, footage from across the country flashed, candlelight vigils, protests swelling in cities from Atlanta to Chicago to Los Angeles. Faces young and old held signs with her name, their voices merging in a chant that rolled like thunder through the streets. Justice for Naomi. Justice for all. Tears welled in Naomi's eyes, not from pride, but from recognition. Her humiliation had become a movement, her silence a rallying cry. Outside, lightning flickered in the distance again, but this time the storm felt different. Less like destruction, more like cleansing. Naomi stood, adjusting her scarf, her spine straight. Tomorrow would come, and with it the reckoning she had promised. Tomorrow, she said softly, mostly to herself, we stop reacting and start restoring. The clock ticked on, steady and certain. The night held its breath, and somewhere deep in the quiet hum of the city the sound of justice began to stir. The sun rose over New Orleans like a verdict, heavy, golden, and impossible to ignore. Outside the federal courthouse, the air buzzed with tension. Reporters jostled for position behind yellow tape. Protesters filled the marble steps, chanting with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the city. Signs waved in the humid air, justice for Naomi, justice for all. Inside, the courtroom filled to capacity long before proceedings began. The murmur of voices hung low and reverent like the hum before a hymn. Cameramen whispered into microphones. Pencils tapped nervously against notepads. The world was watching. At the center of it all sat the woman who had turned humiliation into history. Judge Naomi Carter entered through a side door, escorted by 2 federal marshals. She wore her black judicial robe once again, the fabric pressed and perfect. Around her head she had wrapped a simple golden and black scarf, a crown of quiet defiance. The crowd rose as one. The scraping of chairs filled the room like a wave. For a long moment no one moved. No one breathed. Naomi didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her very presence spoke louder than words. When she finally took her seat behind the bench, the room exhaled. 2 men sat shackled at the defense table, orange jumpsuits stark against the polished wood. Officers Blake Rivera and Sean Dalton, the same men whose laughter had echoed in that concrete cell, now stared at the floor, their faces pale, their arrogance gone. Beside them, their attorney Mark Kessler shuffled papers with trembling hands. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the chill of the air conditioning. Naomi glanced at the docket, then at the 2 men before her. Her face betrayed nothing. Only her voice, calm and clear, carried the full gravity of the moment. The court will now come to order, she said. This is the case of the people versus officers Blake Rivera and Sean Dalton. Kessler stood quickly. Your Honor, the defense moves for immediate recusal on the grounds of bias and prior. Denied, Naomi interrupted. Her tone was steady, absolute. Proceed. A murmur rippled through the gallery. She lifted her gavel once and silence fell like a curtain, the kind of silence that demanded respect, the kind that made power itself tremble. The court will now review the evidence, she said. Let the record show that all exhibits have been verified by federal investigators. At her signal, Agent Lena Morris from the FBI stepped forward to operate the evidence display. The lights dimmed. A screen descended behind the witness stand. Exhibit A, Naomi said. The first image appeared, the grainy footage from the body camera. The room seemed to stop breathing. On the screen, the clippers buzzed, the officers laughed, and Naomi's hair fell in dark curls to the cement floor. Rivera's voice echoed through the speakers, cruel, casual. Smile for the body cam, he said. A gasp rippled across the courtroom. Dalton flinched, unable to watch. Rivera sat rigid, jaw tight, eyes glassy. Naomi's expression didn't change. She watched it all as if it were evidence in someone else's case, her face composed. Her heart steady, but inside she could still feel the cold metal of that bench, the smell of bleach, the sting of humiliation. She let the memory pass through her and out again, leaving only purpose behind. When the footage ended, Naomi nodded once. Exhibit B spreadsheets filled the screen next. Payroll documents, falsified overtime logs, duplicate signatures, ghost arrests. Each number, each column was a confession typed in digital ink. Exhibit C, she said. Text messages appeared next, projected large enough for the entire gallery to read. Rivera to Dalton. We'll teach her to shut her mouth. Dalton, make it hurt. Make it stick. Rivera, we're taking care of the judge problem. The room erupted, murmurs, curses, disbelief. Someone whispered, judge problem? Another hissed, God help them. Naomi struck the gavel once, the sharp crack slicing through the noise. The defendants claim their actions were standard procedure, she said evenly. But the law is not built on convenience. It is built on conscience. Her gaze swept the courtroom. The question before this court is not what they did, but why they believed they could. Then came the witnesses. The first was Caleb Freeman, a young man barely out of his teens. His hands trembled as he took the oath, but his voice carried. "Officer Dalton arrested me in 2019, he said I looked suspicious walking home. They shaved my head in the booking room, said it was for hygiene. I was 17. Dalton stared at the table. Next came Elena Ruiz, a nurse in her 40s. She recounted being strip-searched on the side of the road after a traffic stop. Her voice broke halfway through, but she didn't stop. I thought I was the only one, she said. Seeing Judge Carter stand there still standing after what they did, it gave me courage. Naomi listened to every word, not as a victim, but as a witness. For each testimony, she thanked the speaker personally and reminded them, "Your courage is part of this record." By the time the 16th victim finished, the air in the courtroom had changed. The story was no longer about scandal. It was about reckoning. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes. Their pens hung motionless, forgotten. Agent Morris approached again. "The final exhibit, Your Honor," she said. Naomi nodded. "Exhibit Z," a recording played. The voices were unmistakable. Rivera and Dalton at a bar 3 nights after the incident. The audio was rough but clear enough. Rivera's voice slurred slightly, thick with drink. "She thought she could scare us. Judge or not, she's still just another—" The recording cut off just before the slur. The courtroom froze. The silence that followed was a living thing. Dense, electric. Naomi set her gavel down slowly. "That will be enough." Her gaze moved between them. Rivera's shoulders sagged. Dalton's eyes glistened with tears he refused to let fall. "You believed your badges made you untouchable," she said. "That justice was something you could mock. That humiliation could replace accountability." She paused. "But justice does not humiliate. Justice restores." The words fell like stones into water, rippling through every corner of the room. Naomi turned to the prosecution. "The court is ready for sentencing." The prosecutor rose but didn't speak. Everyone already knew the outcome. Naomi adjusted her glasses, her tone unwavering. "Officer Blake Rivera," she began, "for civil rights violations, falsifying official reports, and abuse under color of law, this court sentences you to 8 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Rivera closed his eyes. She turned to Dalton. "Officer Sean Dalton for the same charges, plus aggravated assault and evidence of repeated sexual misconduct during booking procedures. This court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison." A low murmur spread through the gallery, rising like a tide. Dalton shot to his feet, shouting, "This is a public lynching." Naomi didn't flinch. "What happened to me was an assault," she said. "What is happening to you is justice." Her gavel came down once. The sound reverberated through the chamber like thunder. The officers were led away, wrists chained, heads bowed. Neither looked back. For a moment no one spoke. Then the room erupted in applause. Soft at first, then growing, unstoppable. Reporters lowered their cameras. Victims embraced. Even the guard stood a little straighter. Outside, the chants that had begun as protest now rose in celebration. Justice for Naomi. Justice for all. Naomi stood behind the bench, letting the sound wash over her. She felt no triumph, only clarity. A quiet knowing that something larger than herself had moved through that room. When she finally stepped outside, sunlight poured down on the courthouse steps. The Louisiana sky was bright and endless. Cameras flashed, but she didn't hide. She paused, untied her scarf, and let the warm air touch her bare scalp. The reporters surged forward. Questions flew like sparks. "Judge Carter, what does this verdict mean to you? Do you plan to continue serving on the bench? Do you forgive them?" Naomi lifted a hand. The crowd fell silent. "They tried to strip me of my dignity," she said, her voice strong, clear. "Instead, they revealed their own disgrace. And now, justice has the last word. The crowd erupted. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, their echoes rising above the cheers. For the first time in days, Naomi smiled. Not for the cameras, not for the applause, but for the truth that had finally found its place. The applause faded slowly, replaced by the low hum of voices. People hugging, crying, praying. Across the courthouse plaza, candles began to appear, flickering in the humid air. The crowd didn't disperse. They stayed as if unwilling to let the moment end. Naomi stepped down the marble stairs, her robe flowing behind her like a shadow of authority reborn. Ava waited near the bottom, tears shining in her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, "you did it." Naomi took her daughter's hands. "No," she said softly. "We did." They stood together for a long time, watching as the crowd's chant rose again, stronger, unified. Unending justice for Naomi, justice for all. Above them, the sky broke open into brilliant sunlight, and for the first time since the storm, the air felt clean. That night, when the courthouse emptied and the city finally slept, Naomi returned to her chambers. The robe hung over the chair again, but this time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a calling renewed. She walked to the window and looked out at the Mississippi River, now calm, the reflection of streetlights rippling across its dark surface. The city had changed. The nation had too. But beneath it all, one truth remained, the same truth she had lived, endured, and proved. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't humiliate. It restores, and as long as someone stands to speak it aloud, it will never die. Naomi closed her eyes, letting the peace settle deep in her bones. Tomorrow would bring more battles, more cases, more questions. But for tonight, the silence was sacred. When she finally turned off the lights and stepped out of the chamber, the faint echo of her gavel still seemed to linger in the air, steady, certain, eternal. The sound of a nation beginning to listen. The echoes of the gavel still lingered long after the courtroom emptied. Its sound had rolled through the marble halls like thunder, reverberating into the streets, carried by every recording, every live broadcast, every trembling whisper that passed from one person to another. For a moment, New Orleans itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the roar, a sound of release, of vindication, of a city and a nation, finally exhaling after too long in silence. Judge Naomi Carter stood at the top of the courthouse steps as the sunlight struck her face. Below her, thousands of people surged in waves of color and sound. Journalists shouted her name. Cameras clicked like a chorus. Somewhere a brass band had begun to play softly, its notes floating above the chants. She raised her hand once, asking for quiet. The noise faded almost instantly. "They tried to strip me of my dignity," she said. Her voice, steady and resonant, reached across the plaza, through every lens into living rooms across the country. Instead, they revealed their own disgrace. And now justice has the last word. The crowd erupted again. Bells from the old cathedral down the street began to chime, their echoes folding into the cheers. Naomi stood still for a moment longer, letting the sound wash through her. Not pride, not triumph, but peace. When she descended the steps, Ava was waiting for her, eyes red but shining. "You did it." "Mom," she whispered. Naomi smiled faintly. "No," she said. "We did it. All of us who refused to stay silent." Reporters surged forward, microphones extended like arrows. She said nothing more. She had spoken enough. The verdict was her final statement. As she and Ava walked to the car, Naomi felt the warm Louisiana sun against her scalp, the same head that had once been shorn in mockery now glowing in the light. She didn't hide it. She wouldn't. That evening, the courthouse steps became sacred ground. People left candles, flowers, and handwritten notes. Some knelt, some sang. Across the city, church bells rang at the same hour, joined by car horns and clapping hands. Television anchors tried to maintain composure, but their voices trembled. "The sentencing of Officers Rivera and Dalton," one reporter said solemnly, "marks not only a personal victory for Judge Naomi Carter, but a turning point in the nation's ongoing reckoning with systemic abuse." By nightfall, the footage of Naomi's verdict had been replayed millions of times. The clip where she said, "What happened to me was an assault. What is happening to you is justice," became a refrain on screens and streets alike. Murals appeared overnight on walls in New Orleans, Atlanta, Detroit, and Oakland. Her image, bald head crowned in golden light, became a symbol, not of victimhood but of endurance, of grace under fire. People began to whisper her name like a promise. Naomi Carter. A name that once belonged only to a judge now belonged to a movement. In Washington, lawmakers scrambled to catch up with the tide. Congressional hearings convened within weeks, fueled by the evidence uncovered during the trial and the firestorm of public demand. From those hearings emerged a bill, named in her honor, the Carter Civil Rights Reform Act. Its purpose was clear: to dismantle the machinery of impunity that had protected officers like Rivera and Dalton for generations. The act mandated federal oversight for police misconduct, established independent review boards in every state, and required body cameras to remain on at all times during public encounters. When it passed unanimously through Congress, the nation paused again. Even cynics admitted it was rare to see unity like that in modern politics. Naomi didn't attend the signing ceremony. She watched it from her living room, Ava beside her. The president signed the bill into law with a simple remark: "Justice is not a privilege. It is the proof that our nation still believes in conscience." Naomi's face remained still, but her eyes shimmered. Ava turned to her. "They named it after you." Naomi shook her head gently. "They named it after the truth. I was just its witness." Her days returned to a quiet rhythm, though the world refused to let her fade. Letters poured in, thousands from across the globe. Some were from judges, prosecutors, and police officers, each confessing how her story had shaken something in them. Others came from ordinary people, teachers, nurses, students, prisoners, each one thanking her for reminding them that dignity was a weapon no oppressor could steal. Naomi read as many as she could. Some made her cry. Some made her smile. But all of them confirmed what she already knew. Justice had found its echo. She continued to serve on the bench. Each morning, she walked through the courthouse doors, head uncovered, unashamed, and took her seat behind the same wooden desk that had once felt like a shield, and now felt like a beacon. The first few weeks were awkward. People stared. Some whispered. But soon silence turned to reverence. Lawyers argued before her with renewed caution, not from fear but respect. Every defendant who stood in her courtroom looked at her differently, not just as a judge, but as proof that the system could correct itself, however painfully. And in those walls, Naomi became what she had always hoped to be, a teacher. Justice, she told a young public defender one afternoon, isn't the punishment of the guilty. It's the restoration of what was broken. Never forget that difference. Outside the courthouse, the movement continued to grow. Protests turned into policy forums. Anger turned into reform. Young activists wore shirts that read, "Grace is stronger than cruelty," a phrase she'd once spoken in an interview when asked if she regretted anything. "No," she had replied. "They thought they were taking something from me, but they gave me the chance to show the world that grace is stronger than cruelty." That clip alone played on countless newsreels, documentaries, and graduation ceremonies. Universities invited her to speak. Civil rights organizations gave her awards she rarely attended. She didn't crave recognition. She craved progress. Every award, she told Ava, is a reminder that the work isn't done. The months passed. The world changed, not completely, but enough. Police departments adopted new transparency measures. Body cam footage became public record. For the first time in decades, officers accused of misconduct were investigated, not ignored. The reforms didn't erase injustice, but they slowed its spread, like sunlight touching a mold that had grown too long in the dark. And in every hearing, every policy meeting, every speech that began with "in the wake of Judge Carter's case," the point was the same. Humiliation could not destroy what truth had already sanctified. Naomi's story inspired hundreds to come forward, victims who had once buried their pain beneath fear, Some found closure. Others found courage. A middle school teacher in Alabama wrote, "When they humiliated you, I saw myself. But when you walked back into that courtroom, I remembered who I was." A police officer from Chicago wrote, "You reminded me why I became one of the good ones. Thank you for giving us no excuses." A woman from California wrote simply, "Because of you, I reported him. Every letter mattered. Every voice mattered." Naomi answered as many as she could with the same closing line, "Truth never dies when it's spoken aloud." A year after the trial, a journalist visited her home for an anniversary interview. The house was modest, filled with light and quiet music. Naomi sat by the window, sipping tea, dressed simply in white. Her head remained bare, the faint shadow of regrown curls framing her face. The interviewer asked, "Do you ever think about that night in the cell?" Naomi smiled faintly. "Every day," she said, "but not with bitterness. It reminds me of what dignity costs, and what it's worth." "And what do you think people see when they look at you now?" "I hope," she said, "they see possibility. That integrity isn't proven in comfort. It's tested in humiliation, in loss, in the moments when silence would be easier but wrong." The interviewer hesitated. "Do you believe America has changed?" Naomi looked out the window at the Mississippi River glittering beyond the trees. "Change," she said softly, "is not a thunderclap. It's a heartbeat. It happens slowly with every truth spoken aloud, every witness who refuses to look away." Her eyes lingered on the horizon. "I've seen too much to believe in perfection," she added. "But I've also seen enough to believe in progress." The journalist stopped recording then, realizing the interview was over. Some things were meant not to be quoted, but felt. That night, Naomi sat alone in her study. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of crickets and the soft tick of a clock. She opened a small wooden box on her desk. Inside were the remains of what had once been her hair, locks swept up from the jail floor, given to her later by the same young officer who'd helped expose the video. He'd written her a note, for evidence, or remembrance, whichever you need. Naomi had kept it not out of pain but as proof. Proof that the body can be violated and still remain whole. That dignity, once rooted, grows back stronger than hair ever could. She closed the box and exhaled. In her living room, the TV flickered. A news anchor was reporting on another protest. This time in another city, another story of police misconduct. The crowd's chants were the same. No justice, no peace. But among the signs, one phrase stood out on a banner held by a group of teenagers. "Justice is quieter. It arrives when no one's laughing anymore." Naomi smiled. The words she'd once whispered in a jail cell had outlived the men who mocked her. As months turned into years, her influence deepened, not through fame, but through faith. Law schools taught her case as a landmark in modern civil rights. Church leaders quoted her in sermons about humility and courage. Parents told their children her story as a lesson in resilience. She never retired. She didn't want to. Her courtroom had become more than a place of law. It was a sanctuary of fairness. Every time she raised her gavel, she remembered the sound of the clippers, the laughter of the men who thought power made them invincible. That memory became her compass, a reminder that justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. Sometimes, after particularly difficult hearings, she would walk down to the riverfront where the city's noise softened into the whisper of water. She'd stand there, feeling the wind on her scalp, remembering the woman she had been before all this, and realizing she was stronger now. One evening, years after the trial, Ava joined her there. The sun was setting, streaking the sky in crimson and gold. "Mom," Ava said softly, "do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Naomi took her daughter's hand, their fingers intertwining. "No," she said. "I wish the world hadn't needed it. But I don't wish it away. Some fires burn because they must." They stood in silence, watching the water flow, a mirror of all that had changed, and all that still needed to. When they turned to leave, a mural caught Naomi's eye on a nearby wall. It showed her standing tall in her robe, one hand raised, her head bare beneath a halo of light. Below the image, painted in bold white letters, were her own words. When you face injustice, don't let anger define you. Let purpose guide you, Naomi smiled. That's enough legacy for me, she said. Ava squeezed her hand. You're not done yet, Naomi laughed softly. Neither is justice. That night back at home, she sat at her desk once more, the lamplight soft around her. She opened her journal and wrote the final words she would ever share publicly, a message to those who would carry her story forward. When you face injustice, do not answer it with rage alone. Rage burns fast. Purpose endures. When the world tries to strip you bare, remember that truth cannot be shaved away. Dignity is not what they grant you. It's what you never surrender. Justice is not something handed down from authority. It's built by ordinary people who refuse to be silent. She closed the book. Outside, the river flowed on, steady and eternal. In the quiet, she could almost hear it. The faint echo of that day's applause, the ringing bells, the soft murmur of countless voices still repeating her name, not in mourning, but in faith. Naomi Carter leaned back in her chair, eyes heavy, heart light, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that the truth she had spoken would keep echoing long after the world stopped listening.